think right before we start, because we have Jasun and Tessa, and Robert, we have met over MEV Roast. Would actually love to kind of hear a bit on your particular research area.
Sure, I'm happy to start. I'm Robert Miller, former algorithmic trader, now product manager at Consensus, focusing on some enterprise stuff. I consider myself as someone who might be a future research fellow, and I'm very interested in the space. So here to learn and listen in on the conversation and contribute where I can, but don't have a particular area of focus to bring today.
Great. I think we'll have plenty more research questions on the side, but thank you for joining us.
Okay, so I am Justin Lee. So I am an assistant professor of finance at George Mason University, and my research covers a bunch of different areas in finance. So, in blockchain, most of them would be like the industrial organization of mining pools, the economic value creation of crypto tokens in platform building. And I've also been recently looking at in Consensus. So I'm looking forward to learn more about MEV.
I'll go next. My name is Tessa. If I was at the Roost, I'm a quant trader from a high frequency prop trader. I'm kind of like Robert, where I'm just trying to get the lay of the land and get the research tools necessary. Definitely done the research in terms of financial trading. The blockchain is a little bit different, and I'm just getting a handle on what's available and what needs to happen to go forward on the research. So glad to help out where I can, but it's going to be a learning curve. Thank you.
All right, great. So thanks for joining, and Austin, hi. So let's start with each of our research fellows who have submitted the FRPs to take us onto a quick dive into your FRP. We suggest that you this is casual. This is not peer review. Don't worry. This is we're in the industry, but I think it's more about articulate your point, and especially in light of addressing certain comments that has been raised by the FRP editors. Perhaps, Surya, do you want to start? Feel free to share screen. Sorry.
Yeah, sure. Okay. Yeah, give me 1 second. Where the hell is it? Oh, there it is. Okay, cool. Can you maybe you can see you can see this? Everything's good? Yes. Okay, cool. Yeah, so really the bottom, oh wait, this is the pull request. Yeah, so the main purpose of this FRP really is so first I think is to categorize sort of how how auctions in sort of this crypto space are different from auctions in literature. So sort of, like Phil, I think, pointed out in a comment on the PR, really that, in this area and in ad auctions, right? Like it's really easy to collude and sort of, try to come up with cooperative strategies as somebody who's doing MEV auctions or even ad auctions. And so I think the main goal here really is to first survey the existing auction literature and sort of compare that with what exists right now in the crypto space in terms of sort of what projects have auctions, their design choices and their reasoning behind it, and sort of trying to find where literature can apply to the crypto space and where it falls short. And really where it falls short is, I think, in the place where the major contribution will be towards this paper, in essentially categorizing, what are the realities of auctions in the crypto space and where literature falls short. So that's goal one. Goal two really is to then given some new insight on how these auctions in crypto space have to be studied and modeled. What can we borrow from existing literature in terms of Karen pointed out as well. It isn't just about looking at the high level sort of textbooks existing and the essentially the old-fashioned approach to auctions that Tim Roughgarden's algorithmic game theory book sort of goes through, but also looking at recent research to look at really what kind of equilibria can be achieved and sort of what results can be imported into our MEV auctions. And so if you go through the sort of the research questions, I think the main one I just said was, how do crypto auctions differ from existing literature? And sort of then it comes around to categorizing these strategy space inter auction, sort of what assumptions about collusion can we make? Can we bound maybe collusion sets? How much collusion is okay? This is another thing that Tarun also suggested. And one other thing is that currently in the MEV auction, MEV Geth design, I think it only accepts for example, a single bundle in the block, and then that's what the miner chooses. However, the more I think interesting problem is whether the miner can include multiple such possibly overlapping bundles as well, and how and what is a good algorithm for selecting these bundles for maximizing how much value that the miner can extract. So I think there's some interesting questions there. Along this vein of thought, I think is also gathering I think more anecdotal evidence for for example from Gnosis and other projects and other auctions on sort of how they sort of motivate their design choices, how they take into account possible collusion, and just in general have a sense of what are the practical implications of auctions in the space. And I think as a conclusion from all the sort of questions, I think the goal at the end is to come up with a taxonomy of auctions that could work for MEV and sort of have a good way of systematizing how we can think about auctions, how we can choose certain mechanisms and designs, and eventually how they will impact sort of this MEV, the MEV Geth that we're thinking about. So in that vein, there's questions, for example, as computational complexity, which, for example, betting on permutations, a lot of combinatorial auctions are very difficult to compute, like an optimal strategy. So there it's worth exploring, potentially suboptimal strategies that are, like I think Karan also said, that are good enough. And yeah, so that's essentially the main questions that I'm trying to answer in this FRP. And methodology, I think, is what I said, right? Just do a survey of literature of sort of cutting edge on computational complexity regarding auctions, as well as gathering anecdotal evidence from existing projects. And that's sort of a high-level view of what this FRP entails. I think there might be I should share the link for it in the chat. Maybe you guys don't have it, and you guys can also look through the questions perhaps in more detail. Okay, so here's the link for that. And let me go to the comments in the PR. That might be more insightful as well. So yeah, I mean, most of the comments I think came in the form of suggestions on where to look. I think Tarun's comment seems quite sort of in depth. I think I'm hoping given how helpful he's been in this sort of one commenting phase, I can sort of lean on him a lot in terms of asking him questions about auctions and sort of just because he seems to be a lot more knowledgeable about this space than I am. But yeah, so I mean, I think I also brought up, I think, a lot of his points in what I had said previously. But yeah, I think that's basically it about going through what the FRP is about, what we're trying to answer, and sort of how I'm going to go about it, the methodology as well. See, I mean, like I'll also say, like I'd also said, I think in the last call, that I'm not very well versed in auction theory. So this is also somewhat a new area to me. But I'm currently going through Tim Garden's lectures and a few papers on ad auctions, and I'm hoping from there, it'll be smooth sailing until January. Oh, hi, Tarun. I think he's on this call now.
Yep, thank you, Sarah. Is there any other comments on the FRP aside from Tarun's? If not, we could ask actually Tarun to kind of share a bit more so we can jump to the discussion. And also, Sarah, thank you for the putting the FRP together. I think research fellowship is about exploring these open questions. So I think the learning process and also like kind of the collective research process is an important part of it. So appreciate everyone who jointly comment and make the proposals. So.
Yeah, so I think Tarun's comments are probably the most in-depth, and since he's here, maybe he can also sort of expand on them a bit. But the other comments were largely suggestions. I think I already covered what Phil also commented on here. I've added that into the FRP already. But yeah, I think that's about it with regards to comments.
Awesome. So maybe we can ask Tarun, would you like to just share a bit more context in light of the comments that you have made?
Yeah, I mean, I think the main thing that I was trying to get at is that you're never going to find a like actual thing where you can prove something very directly for, I think, the type of problem you have in mining. There's just like a lot of like weird complexities where you're not going to get like an exact solution. So I think I was just trying to provide some examples of like, hey, take traditional auction theory, but remember that you kind of will eventually need to be happy with a good enough type of solution. But there are some tools from traditional algorithmic game theory that are, still worth understanding. But yeah, I think the combining kind of like, last 30 years of research is that we've kind of seen that like the formal things are much harder to actually get to work in practice.
Cool. Yeah, definitely. I think in particular, we definitely have a couple more folks here who's also familiar with such literature. Maybe we could have a bit more of a discussion on just this particular FRP. And also, Phil, you have also commented on this particular FRP. Would also like to hear you sharing some of the context.
One thing, though, I would like to ask Tarun is just sort of what do the edges on this graph represent?
Yeah, good question. 3D Brouwer refers to Brouwer's fixed point theorem, which basically is one of the ways you kind of prove that there's a stationary state for a certain class of equilibria. And basically, each of these edges is some type of assumption you make that's stronger than the kind of like topological assumptions you make for Brouwer. And sort of like this is a series of, yeah, each edge is like, you could think of as like an extra constraint or assumption in order to get like a formal kind of like incentive compatible auction.
Well, as in like, are the edge labels representing Like it
Oh,
seems like they seem to.
that section in the book.
Okay, yeah, okay.
Like,
That's
took that
what I thought, but I
picture-
wanted to make sure. Yeah.
I took that picture more to give you an idea that
Yeah.
one way of stratifying the agent strategy space is
Mhm.
to take the set of to like try to say like, okay, assume agents are kind of like arbitrary.
Mhm.
Then you kind of have like something generic like Brouwer, and then the next thing is assume the agents have preferences. Then you get this preference game, and then the next thing is
Right.
assume their preferences are bounded. They're not like arbitrarily interacting with a bunch of different, there's not long range interactions, and you get
Right.
the degree thing. ... Right? Like all
Right,
of
yeah.
these things kind of, this is kind of the way game theorists stratify the space of like strategies by first saying like, what game can be solved for arbitrary strategy? What game can be solved for somewhat constrained strategy, somewhat more constrained, ... But these maps are like a nice way to visualize like what the assumptions are.
Yeah, I like it a lot. Thanks for sharing that.
Yeah, I've seen similar maps in the crypto literature also with like, just various results that build on each other or models that are kind of stronger versions of other models. So I think having something like that would be cool for crypto auctions. And maybe it's just covered in existing literature, but I think that's really the question that we have to answer and communicate here. So yeah, other than that, my specific comments, I think Surya already covered most of them pretty explicitly by adding them into the FRP. But they were mostly about kind of focusing on this difference as like the main contribution here, and using our crypto expertise to kind of convey something to people who work more on kind of stratifying these strategies. So those were kind of my comments. Also, I know I sent my comments in very late, so thank you to anyone who's actually read them as they were like 4 hours old only. So yeah, thanks for integrating them so quickly, Surya.
Let's move on maybe to the next FRP, Tina.
Sure. Just want to hear if there's any folks who have any questions on this particular or comments on this particular FRP. If you do, feel free to send in a chat. We can come back to it, and then we can discuss more. But let's perhaps move on to the next XRP.
I will also say, sorry, I just want to also add in it, that alongside, if anyone here is sort of also interested in answering any of these questions in the FRP, I'd love to, get as many, I think, heads in the problem as I could. So I'll just toss that out there as well.
Awesome, thanks. Arthur?
Yes, hello. Let me share my screen quickly. Can you see that?
Yep.
Awesome. Is it too big, too small? Should I change anything? Everything readable?
Maybe a little bigger would be good, but it's at the limit, I'd say. Yeah, perfect.
Okay, cool, awesome. So the first FRP that we proposed is about MEV and liquidations. The main reason we find liquidations interesting is because it's it's a narrow but very important use case. And like depth in general, right, seems to be quite an important financial instrument in traditional finance, but as well as in DeFi. So yeah, thanks a lot to everyone for the many comments on the FRP. I think we can maybe just go through it sequentially as well. So this is just an intro that this is a lending market is quite large. There we observed that there are fixed spread liquidation mechanisms such as Aave compound and DYDX, where you can liquidate based on you get a liquidation bonus, which is a fixed amount depending on the asset that you're looking at and depending on the platform. And then there are other liquidation mechanisms such as MakerDAO, which do like an auction-based system, which are auction-based, where I think the current time frame is like 6 hours for the auction. So it's a fundamentally different way of performing liquidations. And these sources of liquidations, or these different liquidation mechanisms, they kind of create different opportunities for MEV. The fixed spread liquidation ones can be done in one atomic transaction, often coupled with flash loans. So this is something that miners or MEV traders could easily kind of snap. While MakerDAO auctions are probably a bit trickier, except when you're reaching the end of an auction, there might be a game depending on the price change of the collateral of the collateral value that you would buy. Yeah, so that's a small intro. So I think there were some attacks that we mentioned, or liquidation price oracle attacks that we mentioned. So the goal, right? So the goal of this FRP would be to study the past and current status of blockchain liquidations. Basically, just getting first like a very simple overview of what markets are we looking at. I mean, this is probably something that some of you have already seen on certain blogs. I'm quite aware of, I think Tarun did a cool paper on Compound. This is actually something that Konstantinos shared here also in the discussion. Actually, I haven't seen this paper before. Yeah, this is that's great. But like DYDX, I'm not sure if this has been analyzed in public. Maybe there are some charts on Dune Analytics. I haven't checked. So this is more like to get started. Then what are the gas price distributions that are paid for liquidation events? Are they actually competitive liquidations happening? Yes, they are. But this is like, it's good to analyze this just to get started here. What are the different liquidation methods, right? How do they differ with respect to MEV? So this is something that I mentioned in the intro. There's fixed spread liquidation, which seems to be a bit different MEV-wise than auctions. But that should be analyzed properly. Which mechanism avoids MEV? So is there any liquidation mechanism that can reduce the risk of MEV? Then how sensitive are the current debts to liquidation? So if somebody can manipulate a price oracle, whether it's an on-chain price oracle or some off-chain order book, how easily can we kind of trigger liquidations? Because once we trigger liquidations, we trigger MEV, and then an MEV miner, for instance, might be interested to anticipate this upfront, right? How can we design a possible liquidation mechanism that mitigates MEV? So the existing ones are probably different with respect to MEV, but how can we design a new one that mitigates it overall? Right. So do you want me to go into any specific questions, or yeah, we discussed quite a bit here on this pull request already. Do you have any particular questions that we should address now?
I think half of the folks here are either working on MEV Inspect or they are very familiar with liquidations in general. So I would love to open this up for the folks who are FRP editors in the audience, as well as those of you who are looking at this this FRP for the first time, to raise your questions and just hop straight into discussion.
Sounds great. Yeah, regarding there was actually a question regarding we mentioned, yeah, it would be quite nice to integrate this somehow into MEV Inspect, but then we realized we probably only need to look into events. So, I mean, I'm not sure there's any actually infrastructure needed. Like the word infrastructure, anyways, is quite vague. So I think we can just crawl events because whenever there's a liquidation, there's an event. And there should be quite a simple filter, at least for liquidations. Yeah. if I'm not mistaken.
From events alone, you might not catch the checks though, right? So you might have like say 50 transactions that go out attempting to liquidate, and one will be successful, and you'll get an event for that. But the other 49 will perform a check to see whether or not the liquidation is available to them, and then fail if not, and you won't catch you won't catch those failed attempts looking only at events.
Right, we only see the winners. Yeah, agree. It's true. The failed one might help if we want to kind of look into how competitive it is. Which, I mean, the gas price already indicates it, right? You can look at the gas price, how much higher is the gas price than the average gas price of the block, and then you already know how much people are likely to overpay. Right, but it's true, the missing ones could help to know how many additional liquidators there are.
Yeah, and if you could identify the failed ones, then you can also measure like what percentage of that block was taken up by people attempting to perform this one the one liquidation. I think it's one of the things MEV Inspect does. And in the case of back running, the gas prices that you'll see on the transactions are they're identical to or very close to the price of the Oracle transaction, and so you wouldn't, if you were only looking at the successful transactions, you wouldn't see the sort of total amount of gas spent attempting to liquidate these things. So you'd be a little bit limited if you only look at events. But the good news is MEV Inspect has a lot of tooling that you could use while doing this research to get access to those other things that you can't get just through events.
Right. The back running, right, this is true. The gas price has to be equal, cannot be lower. I mean, depends on the miner inclusion policy.
Yeah, it can't be higher. Yeah.
Yeah. It can be higher, right? So 80% of the blocks are ordered by roughly, right, by gas price. So for the rest, it might be a random process then. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, but if you expect it to be ordered by gas price, that's fine. Yeah, I think that's all the case, and I think also the other place it would be useful to get failures is for the profit part of this, because I think another thing that was mentioned here is getting the profitability of the bots. So I guess that's kind of what Austin was talking about. Yeah, in general, I think it would be interesting to kind of see how we could merge this with MEV Inspect, just so that we have like a clear path to kind of have it in the dashboard and as part of like the maintenance base for that code base. And also, I think it would be interesting to maybe start looking at these failures and seeing if some of that infrastructure could generally, I don't know, maybe there's some way we can combine like the kind of AMM side of MEV Inspect plus the liquidation side or something like that. I don't know. There might be other kind of research questions here. I would be interested to see more, I guess, on that front.
Mm-hmm.
I think one of the questions also raised by Georgios has, or a couple comments, in fact, point to, you mentioned, Arthur, that your team will be also collecting the data at the same time. If there, one of the questions from Georgios was whether it's possible for us to merge the effort of the data collection from MEV Inspect and what you guys are setting up the infra to collect the data.
Right. I mean, we had planned to only look at events so far. That's why, I mean, we basically just use a vanilla Geth client. There's not really any infrastructure. But if we do extend it towards fail attempts, then probably we have to trace. So in that case, we would just probably be using the trace feature of MEV Inspect, I suppose. But I would need to check with my team.
Awesome.
Yeah, I think that makes sense.
Awesome.
Cool. Should I go to the second FRP, or do you have any more questions on that one?
Well, open to the floor. Scott, or anyone else who's more familiar with Inspect Prompt, if you guys have any questions. I think if not, we can let's move on to your second FRP.
All right. So this is about quantifying the impact of MEV on blockchain security, like the consensus security, not the smart contract security. So we can basically, I mean, there was already the Flashbots paper, the Flashboys paper, for example, mentioned quite clearly that this MEV does destabilize the consensus security. Now, we would like to answer by how much, quantitatively measure or somehow resolve by how much that would be. So I think ideally we want to find kind of a threshold, right? Like at which an MEV miner will start to fork the blockchain. So let's say there's an MEV opportunity, gets broadcast, a miner includes this one, and then there's another miner, and this other miner says, well, I would like to claim this reward for myself because it's 10 times higher than the block reward, and I have 20% of the hash rate, so I'm fine with trying it out, and my likelihood is, well, either I'm expected to win or I'm expected to fail. So because the miners are, I mean, the miners typically have less than 50% of the hash rate, so they will always take up a risk. But I think there's some kind of threshold value at which we can quantify whether, given the MEV value, will a rational adversary miner engage in forking the chain or not? So I think we can find a binary decision here. I hope at least. And it would also be nice to extend this to some kind of a multiplayer game when you have multiple MEV miners, to see how would they engage over an MEV opportunity. Like, what would they do? What is the strategy to maximize their profit? I'm not sure it's easy to find optimal strategies in a multiplayer setting. But like generally, what's the behavior in the multiplayer game? That would be quite interesting to look at. So we could look at quantifying kind of also how bad does it get for the chain, right? I mean, you know that the stale block rate or the orphan, I mean, I don't like the word orphan because an orphan block always has a parent, but orphan or stale blocks kind of quantify the security of a chain. So the higher the stale block rate gets, the more advantages a double spending or selfish miner has. So MEV, in a sense, increases the stale block rate, and ideally we want to quantify by how much. I think there were as well some really nice comments. I think George just mentioned what are the assumptions. So I think assumptions, we, for example, have to make some assumptions such as we know whether the adversary miner knows an average block reward. I mean, this is, I think, a reasonable assumption. We know what's the base plus the transaction fees, expected transaction fees plus uncle. So that's quite relevant. I mean, it's simple. We have to assume that we know the potential MEV reward, which is also, I think, appropriate. And we have to assume that the miner is rational. So rationality assumptions are hard because they might not always be reflective of reality. People are not acting rational all the time. But without rationality, I find it kind of, I'm not really sure how to quantify security at all, because then, I mean, anything can really happen. So it's hard to give any statements. So there was actually a good comment from Georgios. He said that miners are structurally long on Ether, which is true, probably. I mean, I'm not a miner, so I don't know, but I guess so, right? And so if we could, I'm not sure we can quantify to what degree would Ether go down in value? The price of of coin would go down in value if miners would start to extract MEV. If they're not already. And I think this is quite a hard question. So if we could quantify that, then it would be easy to take this into consideration in the model, because then if we know what's the impact of such like an unconventional behavior, because it's a malicious behavior, but it's not really. I mean, the protocol doesn't prevent, right? So it's also a bit hard to say it's adversarial. I would call it maybe unconventional behavior, unconventional mining behavior. So to what degree does it hurt a blockchain coin price? I mean, we have seen other blockchains. I think it was Zerocoin, where they had an inflation bug, which was exploited, but the price didn't go down of the coin. So even like, it's really, sometimes it's quite hard to quantify what's the impact of behavior or so, right? Right, and then, so another cool thing to include would be calculating the number of confs to consider transaction safe under some amount of MEV. And I would like to see an MEV risk metric, and yes, and this could be used for plugin for clients, for example. This is quite, I think this is very useful for users. And I think once we have set up this model, I'm sure there would be some, I mean, we're more than happy to support some developers to build like a proper plugin that can be used or integrated with wallets or so. So like two things I think here, what we ideally can provide is a transaction value, right? So it's basically a threshold, right? So transaction value, if the value is higher than a certain threshold, then an MEV miner with, for example, 10% hash rate will attack it. This is just a rational thing to do. So it's likely that this will be done. So in that case, it's insecure to broadcast that transaction. I think that's probably the ultimate question. Should I broadcast it or not? Or should I privately mine it with a miner with some private agreement like OneInch does? So this threshold, I think, would be quite key to tell a user, if you're gonna issue this transaction, it can be claimed by anyone. So it's an MEV, and you're risking it getting snapped by the dark forest, as some say. So I'm not exactly sure how the number of confirmations matter here, because this is later on in the game. But maybe, I mean, yeah. I mean, we don't know how long. So what the MEV miners would do, they would start to do private mining. So we don't know how long this game will last, right? And that's probably also hard to tell a user. Now you have issued a transaction that this probably which will maybe be claimed by an MEV or a miner, and it might take this miner, I don't know, 10 blocks to fork the chain. So I think this, I mean, I'm not sure this is easy to convey, but just given a value, it's probably quite easy to tell a user, be careful, this might get snapped. Yeah, cool. Any questions?
I think this is this is super interesting. It's an area that I and a lot of people have thought about, I guess, but I would love to see it more formally studied and worked on. I think my main comment is that what I've seen in other people doing research in this game is just because it's so complicated and mining gets so messy and the real world kind of is so politically involved and weird at some point. There's like a lot of papers that kind of build this very complex infrastructure and then get some result. And then it gets like somehow, invalidated by maybe a minor tweak to the model. And it's not clear like which one actually reflects reality and which one is not. So like selfish mining is kind of the area that I'm thinking of when I make this like meta level commentary, where like I think there's a lot of insightful selfish mining work, but there's not like a consensus or like I think a cohesive effort to come up with like a result, like a final understanding of selfish mining, and I don't know if we'll ever achieve that. So I think I would love to hear your thoughts on like how we approach that in the long term, because it's something I've thought about and not been able to answer. But I do think it's definitely worth studying this, and like there's a lot of lower hanging fruit questions that it would be great for us to answer for the community. But I think it's also good to think like longer term, how do we make sure this is like that we can get some fundamental results here that like really are communicatable and kind of the way selfish mining, the first attack was, and maybe the follow-up work, because it was more in the weeds and more kind of argumentative with each other, kind of lost some of that impactfulness, I think.
Yeah, it's a very, very valid point. It's kind of hard to say now this is the result and everything that comes after is wrong or yeah. I mean, it's true. The researchers, they like to invalidate probably prior results, right? Because this gives them a reason to continue working on things. It's a kind of a job security thing. Yeah, we'd love to hear more comments. Yeah.
There's a question from Jasun in the comments. I'm sorry if I'm not saying your name properly, by the way.
Sorry, didn't see the chat. Clarification, by consensus, you specifically mean? Yeah, Nakamoto. That's actually a good question, right? I mean, we could also look into like, does this change at all for POS? Actually, I think we mentioned this now here. To what degree the results would apply to POS? I mean, yeah, I think this would be also super interesting to explore. I'm not sure there would be a significant difference if you just on a high level consider POS or proof of work as a leader election mechanism. So I'm not sure there would be a fundamental difference here. I think we discussed in like a few weeks ago in one of the calls whether there is any difference of MEV on POS. And I think the idea, the consensus was also more or less that there would not be any major change just because of the change of how we reach consensus.
But I guess a related question I would have there is if we could like unify the analysis somehow. And I think this also leads into the next FRP or whichever one Sunny's is about proof of stake and other protocols. Like, is there some level of abstraction which we can view this process and like the influence points in the ordering decision in some more abstract way that would let us like kind of reason about both proof of work and proof of stake at the same time?
Right.
I think that would be also something worthwhile, or even maybe leaderless protocols I think would be interesting to fit in there. So there's probably some tight collaboration that's possible there, because I assume to understand the POS game, you need to understand this multi-miner game at least somewhat, and vice versa. But yeah, I think that's definitely something that is on the top of everyone's minds, especially how does this change with ETH2 and like how does this change with sharding and rollups? I think like a personal concern I have that's maybe more engineering ETH related and less academic researchy is like with like DAPT, composability and interoperability across shards and layer 2s. So if you have this super heterogeneous like distribution where a few shards or a few L2s have a lot of value and everything else is like a long tail, which is probably what's going to happen, how does that impact like layer 1 security? And especially when it comes to manipulating transactions between those shards / layer 2 protocols. So I think that's also something that I would love to think about at some point.
Cool. I think that's a nice summary, and also just want to be mindful of everyone's time here. We currently budgeted 1 hour, but I would encourage us who would like to extend the discussion to stay on the call for a little bit longer, because I think this call is particularly pre-holiday, so kind of want to after the next FRP presented, figure out kind of the meaningful way of collaboration, as well as some of the gaps in terms of unanswered research questions that we would like recommendations or referrals from all of us here. So author, sorry to, this is a fascinating FRP. I think related to what Sunny and Dave, who's not currently on this call, would like to share with everyone with their FRP. So let's move on to the next one. Sunny?
All right, cool. Can people see my screen? I think so.
Yeah.
Sweet. Okay, so yeah, so my FRP is mostly about kind of like answering that last question, which was how does this work in, I mean, not just proof of stake, but I just described more broadly as alternative chain architectures, something different than what like, ETH 1.0 does. And so basically, let's see. I wanted to base, especially as we see like more like alternative chain architectures like ETH 2.0, Tendermint-based chains, Avalanche. I want to basically see two things. One, in what chain architectures is MEV extractable, and like what are the requirements of a chain that's needed in order to even have like some amount of like extractable value. And then the second would be then more specific of, okay, in the chains that MEV is extractable, what is needed to make the current design of the Flashbots architecture viable. And so by like taking these like requirements of the chain in order to do these two things, then we could like analyze a couple of different models. I think like the three that I was going to suggest was a Nakamoto style proof of stake, so something like ETH 2.0's Casper, a classical BFT, something more like Tendermint, and then a leaderless consensus, something more like Avalanche, and then see how the effects of how this stuff, how consent, I think one of the main negative side effects of MEV is of high MEV is consensus instability, but I think that the consensus instability takes different forms when it's affecting like a Nakamoto style chain versus like a finality BFT chain. I think in a Nakamoto chain, you get these like the time banded attacks, which affect safety, but like on a classical BFT chain, I think the consensus instability is still there. It just takes a different form, usually with negatively affecting liveness. And then the last section is something sort of basically more related to the work that I'm already doing, which is like, so given the properties that like are needed from a chain in order to have MEV be extractable, given those, assuming that these three designs mentioned here do not eliminate like or minimize MEV extraction, given those properties, how can we design a new chain that can reduce the MEV? And yeah, so sorry, I actually didn't get a chance to reply to most of these comments here on the draft because just a couple of hours ago, but I replied to. So I think some of the main questions here is, yeah. So I think what Tarun said here is actually really important. I think that most of the things I wrote actually so far were basically with regards to the consensus protocol, but I do actually agree that I think the design of the mempool is actually probably one of the more interesting like changes across like different architectures that might even be more important than the consensus design. So for example, I know that right now in Tendermint, by default, transactions are not reordered in a mempool based off of fees. They basically are checked to see if they satisfy some minimum fee, and then they're inserted in order of receival. And so, assuming that if that's the default of majority of validators, then how does that affect the MEV extraction process? So I think this is something that definitely should be added, like different mempool designs. And also, like, problem with mempool designs is that they're usually unattributable, or like they're not binding. It's like, you could say that's the default. And so then this has to be analyzed in the sense of like, okay, based off of like, you have to like consider different classes. Like, okay, are all validators following the default strategy for mempool, or are most validators, or some validators? So I think this is something that should be added in more. Phil mentioned that, yeah, so by the way, I've been in my thing, I've been using the taxonomy of like MEV as maximum extractable value. So when I say like reduce MEV, I'm not saying like reduce the amount of MEV that's going to miners or the proposers. I just mean the amount of extractable value as a whole. And then, yes, this is what Return mentioned here. This is basically what I was saying, where like, the consensus instability in like BFT systems basically shifts from safety faults to liveness faults, because, if you want to become the block proposer of this block, in like Tendermint's chain, in proof of work, one of the strategies you could do is just like buy more hash power and like try to have a higher probability of winning. In Tendermint chains, you could easily, because there's not a really good opportunity to invest resources into buying more hash power, you could instead invest resources into like DDoSing other proposers until you get an opportunity to be the proposer. But I think the game theory of this becomes very like unstable, so I think that needs some research. Yeah, I think those are like the two main classes of comments. I guess I'll open it up to the audience on this call to if I kind of went a little bit fast. If anyone wants me to clarify anything or have any questions about this, please let me know.
Yeah, I think again, super important research area, and I'd love to see those insights. I'm especially personally interested in the leaderless protocols and like how that differs, like whether we need special probabilistic techniques to reason about it, or how we even think about it, or how we quantify MEV in those systems. But I think all three categories are super interesting, and yeah. I think it would also be good to maybe collaborate with Arthur if you guys end up working on these same kind of questions, just to, maybe eventually have a common language / common writing interface between these questions. I think that would be cool.
Love to exchange more.
Do you think that, so one question I had was like, okay, if we bring in this like mempool analysis, like I'm worried it might turn into like this like n squared thing where like I wonder if like every combination of consensus protocol and mempool strategy has to be like thought about independently. And so I'm a little bit worried about that. If you have any thoughts on how to like tackle that, if that turns out to be the case. It might turn out to not be the case, but
yeah, no, I think that's an interesting question. I wish I knew the answer. Maybe there'll be like some sort of pattern of like, back running follows the same pattern because there's some fundamental kind of way these things are ordered that's like the same process. Like the actions you have can influence your position in the process in like this way, but not this way. But I don't have that like taxonomy. Like I haven't mapped it out, so I don't know. So I think that's an interesting question also for the FRP to just try to go through maybe a few of those combinations and see if there's anything unifying, or if it's like, oh crap, we actually think that we need to look at all these combinations. I think that would be an interesting kind of first thing to try to answer. But maybe other people have more thoughts that they've thought about more on this front.
Another thing, like, is, when right now, when it says like alternative chain architectures, it's really focused here on like the consensus protocol and like I guess also now the mempool. But I think like, the place where MEV will most be affected on alternative chain architectures is usually more state machine related stuff. So if you have like a state machine that does like, high has a high amount of privacy, right? Like obviously then the amount of extractable value would be decreased. Or if you had a state machine that like, you know, had some different form of a different execution model, like, maybe it doesn't execute transactions in the order that they are in a block. So do you think that should be in scope for this like FRP, or like should it really just be focused on like these like more consensus and mempool related stuff?
I think, yeah, I'm not sure. I think that's up to you almost. If it's too big of a problem to break off, it could just generate like a separate FRP. If like in doing this, in trying to answer these questions, like over the next, X weeks, we see that like this actually deserves its own whole area of study, which I think is possible, then like one of the ideal outcomes of FRPs for me is to generate more FRPs, which I think is like good research should always generate more questions than it answers. So I actually talked about Alex, like we should talk to Alex, like when we started this, that we should make a rule that you have to open at least one FRP for every closed FRP. Not that I think it's a good idea, but yeah. So I think it's totally reasonable to try to treat it as one, but if it seems to be too much work, then to be like, maybe the product of this FRP is just writing up another FRP among all the other kind of deliverables as a future work direction.
Okay, cool. I think that might be what we end up doing.
Yeah, well, thanks for sharing. And I think that just to, I guess the next step would be try to figure out, I guess, how would be what would be a meaningful way for us to collaborate and help out with the MEE fellows who's working on these questions. I think there's a lot more clarity that perhaps needed from us as an organizational perspective. But actually, I think the more important thing is I want to hear from like kind of the folks here who's on the call. If there are FRPs that you would like to join force with or help out on, and also from the research fellows who's on this call, how you would like to get support. And lastly, how we, from Phil, perhaps Phil and Alex, Alex was coordinating also on the research side. How do we put these FRPs together into I guess the research papers, and or do we want to keep them separate? Open for discussion. I don't think we are very fixated on any particular solutions. It's about practicality and what actually works best.
I do want to mention that Jasun also has a question in the chat about the mempool versus miner perspective that I think is good to consider for Sunny. So I don't know if we want to go over that real quick.
I missed that. Jasun, yeah, would love to address this question first.
So yeah, I agree. Like, the fact that like this is kind of what I mentioned, which like mempool strategies are not like, provable, or like it's really hard to like fault someone for that. So I think like really when we say, I think there's like two examples of where like mempool strategies might come into play. One is, you don't think of it as mempool strategy, you think of it more as like block execution strategy. So, maybe a block doesn't actually specify ordering. The ordering it just specifies inclusion, and then ordering is decided by some state machine level thing. So that's one option of like, when I say mempool ordering strategy, it's really like blocks execution ordering strategy. The other option is you have some system where like, there's not a single block proposer for a block. So you can design a protocol in which, like, you need the inputs of many block proposers to choose the inclusion of transactions into a single block. And if you have that, now you can start to like play with like honesty or like altruism assumptions of like, okay, let's say over half the block proposer or so I call this system joint proposal. So half the joint proposal contributors are altruistic. Then like, how does the MEV extraction like affect there? So yeah, I agree. Like in like the traditional like architecture of a blockchain, where it's like, oh, one proposer uses their mempool to just propose the inclusion and ordering of a block. Yeah, there's not really much like you can do there. But I think it's in some of these different chain architectures that it might be important. Does that answer the question?
I think that was pretty thorough. And I guess, yeah, you guys should feel free to discuss more on GitHub. I think that's a cool point and something that might not be obvious to people and that we should communicate. I guess, Tina, do we want to call out the discussion real quick since we're kind of short on time of how we continue things in the next few weeks / the holidays, and then we can wrap up unless anyone else has any specific requests or comments. We can also take those, I guess.
Yeah, let's move on. While at the same time, just leave your questions in the chat, and we'll address them, or we can take your discussions to GitHub async, which will probably end up being more thoroughly answered. So I guess it's really up to, I think, you guys, Sunny, Arthur, and Phil. Also, Surya, we'll sync with him afterwards. What you guys think would be the most meaningful way to move forward. Also on the call, we have Scott, who's also coordinating the data collection side for MEV Inspect, which also may overlap a bit with the effort from Arthur, your side, on the liquidation FRP. So what would be the most meaningful way for us all to collaborate?
I mean, there are many ways that lead to Rome, but my students basically they are living in a completely different time zone, right? That's why I think like an async communication method is probably best, at least for them. I'm fine with this time. I think the discussions on GitHub were very helpful. Like the comments were really thorough, and this is really great. But I think, yeah, sometimes some calls might be quite helpful too.
So I think, Tina, maybe what I would propose is like if we take some discussions kind of async for the next week or two about specifically how to move forward with these FRPs. I think we have like concrete suggestions here. Like I think some papers / directions are taking shape, and maybe we should try to see if we can kind of all agree async with the editors and like the individual FRP leaders about, how it all kind of works. And then maybe we all come after the holidays and talk about kind of as a group how any cross FRP collaboration could happen.
Sounds good to me. I think it's so basically we're doing it let's say more independently at this moment, and to see how the FRPs shape up as folks take your time to dive into some of these questions and discover more questions. And then when we we will coordinate with each of your team async to follow up on the specific questions and kind of the requests that you may have, and then yeah, let's reconvene after the holidays in January. And I think that would also, I think quite a few of the questions that we get from a process standpoint is what are the actual deliverables? But since the FRPs include the deliverables that each of the MEV fellows will have proposed, so I think the short answer to that is whatever I think you deem necessary as deliverable, including whether that to be a standalone piece of research that to ensue, or just the continued open form of questions. I think at this moment we would like to keep these open-ended.
Yeah, and maybe one last thing before we end, which is that like, and maybe we weren't the best at saying this in our call to FRPs, but I wanted to kind of explicitly say it now. First of all, like I'm very impressed with all the quality, submissions we got, and like thank you guys for being interested in working on this kind of research. I think my priority for like deliverables for this effort, it would be nice if we could kind of communicate big questions to the community in a way that was understandable, in good kind of academic style research to answer some of the important burning questions around MEV, or at least provide some groundwork. And also it would be nice to have things that kind of contribute to this mission that Flashbots has of like reducing the information asymmetry between kind of specialized actors and everyone else. So things like contributing to the dashboard is a perfect example of that. So just keeping those two goals in mind as the FRPs evolve, I think would be great. But I'm very happy with everything I've seen. And yeah, thank you for participating.
Yep. Thank you. And as promised, we did mention that at the end of this research workshop that cap our 2020 research workshops, we would like to send out the thank you MEV fellowship rewards to the grants to the MEV fellows for encouraging you to continue the research that you have proposed. So we'll reach out to you separately for the details of the arrangement. And for the folks here who joined and interested in opening FRPs or answering or joining any of the existing research fellows, reach out to them async on GitHub. I think that's probably the easiest way to do so. Also, just open your own FRP will be the easiest way to take part in our research process. And so if you have any questions, just ask in our Discord. Cool.
Is the pirate party online?
We can share a link of the pirate party. It will be somewhere on a beachy side of the Malibu in California. One of our research engineers is hosting, invited us over, but we shall have them more, over time. So. Oh, Tessa, I did not know you were in LA. Well, I'll send you DM for details then. Yep. Awesome. Thank you all for joining.
Thank you, guys.
Bye.
Thanks, everyone. Thanks for taking the time and
Thank
staying
you,
over.
everyone. Bye.
Thank you guys. Happy holidays.
Happy holidays.
Nice.